There was a major explosion in the dock area where they load the boats up with drugs. They load the boats up with drugs, so we hit all the boats, and now we hit the area. It's the implementation area. That's where they implement, and that is no longer around.
There you have President Donald Trump confirming that the United States has significantly escalated conflict with Venezuela, with the CIA carrying out a drone strike on a port facility in Venezuela last week. This marks the first time the US has actually struck Venezuela on their territory. And the strike was carried out on a dock where US officials claim that the Tren de Aragua gang was storing narcotics that they suspected were going to traffic later. Now, they also told the New York Times that no one on the dock, there was no one on the dock at the time, so no one was killed. But honestly, anything claimed by the Trump administration at this point, especially in regard to Venezuela, should be taken with a grain of salt, since they have been caught lying again and again. But so far, we haven't heard or seen any type of response from Venezuela. Before I give you more details, though, Cenk, your 2 cents.
Yeah, it's still a huge mystery who's driving this war against Venezuela. But at least now we know we're bombing them alongside Somalia, Nigeria, potentially Iran soon. We have a poll up on tyt.com asking you, what's the dumbest place to bomb? So check that out when you get a chance. But certainly Venezuela is high on the list. Let's find out more.
So the Times also reported that the CIA has allegedly developed intelligence on a number of purported drug facilities in Venezuela and Colombia as part of the planning for an expanded campaign. So this is a little bit of foreshadowing information, right? That this could expand into more strikes on Venezuela. And to your point, Cenk, the Trump administration, this anti-war president has bombed like 6 different countries in his second term. It hasn't even been 12 months yet. It's insane. Now, this attack comes after the US continues striking random fishing boats suspected of trafficking drugs. The New York Times published a pretty damning expose on some of the damage that's been caused. And there's been one instance in which they think they might have found marijuana, but when it comes to the global drug trade, Venezuela is not a major player. If anything, they traffic cocaine, but even in that regard, it is a tiny percentage of the cocaine trade in the United States. The US military also launched its 30th strike on a fishing boat this week on Monday. The US has also been seizing Venezuelan oil tankers. Now, the latest killing bring the total number of people extrajudicially executed by the US military at sea to 107. Now, again, the Pentagon has failed to provide a shred of evidence to the American people, proving that they are in fact going after, narco terrorists, a phrase or word that they kind of made up in order to drum up support for their military operations. And even if those boats were supposedly trafficking drugs to the United States, again, no evidence of that. Those boats can't even reach the United States. We don't just extrajudicially murder people, especially when it comes to drugs, right? Like there's usually, you intercept, you ask some questions. If they're trying to traffic drugs, you bring them to justice in a different way. You don't just kill people, everyone on a boat. Now, the regime change is really what the Trump administration wants. Now, they don't say that publicly, but privately they have said it time and time again. And in fact, the chief of staff for the White House, Susie Wiles, admitted as much during an interview with Vanity Fair, saying that President Trump wants to keep on blowing boats up until Maduro cries uncle, meaning Nicolas Maduro. And people way smarter than me on that say that he will. However, if you just check in with Venezuela, you will see that Nicolas Maduro seems to be, I'm sure it's all for show, but he's putting on like a cheery face. He has no intention of stepping down despite the US military buildup off the coast of Venezuela, despite the fishing boats being struck, despite the oil tankers being seized. He remains steadfast in staying in power. and has offered the Trump administration pretty much everything they want in regard to oil reserves. But clearly that's not what the Trump administration is really out for. They want regime change. And for someone like Secretary of State Marco Rubio, this is also very much ideological.
So here's what we know and what we don't know. Number one, we know it's not about the drugs. Donald Trump Jr.'s nose holds more drugs than Venezuela does. So if you bought into that hype, you got totally lied to, and you should be furious at whichever host you're watching that's feeding you those lies. Simple Google search, ask Grok, anything will tell you that Venezuela is a very, very small supplier of drugs. That is not the reason why we're going to Venezuela. And so, by the way, the fact that they're 100% lying about the reason should give you pause for concern. Why are they lying to you? Why don't they tell us what the actual reason is? Well, obviously, they don't want to share the actual reason. So that leads us to speculate. Oil is the number one guess, logically so, largest oil reserve in the world. We almost always attack countries with large oil reserves and no way to protect themselves. So that's why we're partly mental about no one else getting nukes. So later, if they have natural resources, we or Israel or a combination of us can attack them and take their natural resources, and they won't be able to defend themselves. Okay, so that's great strategy. But the problem here is, so that would solve the mystery and we'd be done with it. The problem here is that the oil companies are saying, we don't really want to spend more money developing the oil in Venezuela. Trump is almost pressuring them to do it. Richard Grenell, working for Trump, actually got a deal from Maduro saying, yeah, we'll turn over all our oil to the Americans because he wanted to stay in power. But that didn't do the job. So here's the third thing we know. We definitively want regime change. Now, if we already are getting their oil at whatever price ExxonMobil, Chevron, et cetera wants, why do we need regime change? Well, there's only two reasons why we'd want regime change. One is Marco Rubio is obsessed with toppling the Cuban government. He thinks the Venezuelan government is backing them, so he's got to topple the Venezuelan government so he could topple the Cuban government. And the Cuban Americans and that diaspora here in America, to be honest, they can get mad all they like, are the closest thing we have to the pro-Israel cult in this country, right? So they're mental about, we have to, who cares about America? We have to topple Cuba by any means necessary. That's our number one priority. We don't have a second priority, right? So could that be it? Well, Marco Rubio's Secretary of State, so he's uniquely powerful in that case. Otherwise, that community has a little bit of power, but not overwhelming power. The second group that apparently wants to topple Venezuela, and the folks who are famous for insisting on regime change, are Israel. And Israel says they're working with Hamas and Hezbollah on a tiny little, slingshot program or whatever imagined scenario they've come up with for them to get panicked about it. And Israel believes that no one should ever be say that anybody who's been critical of Israel should ever have any arms, not just nukes, but you can't have ballistic missiles, you can't have drones, because that's what they say that Venezuela might be working with the Iranians on, et cetera. So no drones allowed, no nothing allowed, no weapons allowed, no rocks allowed, nothing. So, and you saw in that clip where Trump is talking about it like an idiot. It's a secret, covert CIA plan. You're not supposed to announce it to an international audience. But anyway, was it him or was it Netanyahu? Because Netanyahu is sitting there like a ventriloquist, smiling next to him, right? All right, so I don't know. I really don't know. I'm not saying it's Israel. I don't have enough evidence of that. It might just mainly be Rubio, or it's a combination of the two. But Anna, last thing that's clear is how painfully dumb this war is. Literally, right. No one in America wants it. We can't even figure out who the secret people are that want it, and yet we're somehow must go to another war.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's just, it flies in the face of everything that Trump promised on the campaign trail. And look, I'm not stupid. Most people who campaign on things that they don't actually intend on fulfilling. But one of the areas that he really gave himself plaudits over was the fact that he didn't start any new wars during his first term. I mean, he certainly engaged in existing wars. He took Obama's drone war and expanded that So much so that the collateral damage was so embarrassing to the US government that they stopped reporting on the number of civilian casualties tied to the drone wars. Look, if you paid close attention to Trump's first term, you would know that he's anything but a peace president. So none of this is surprising to me. But in regard to Israel, I don't think that Israel's the main driver of what Trump's administration is doing with Venezuela. But I do think the fact that, Venezuela is more hostile to Israel as opposed to a country like the United States has motivated Israel to vociferously support what the Trump administration is doing in Venezuela. So much like Iraq, was Israel the main driver in pushing us to invade Iraq in 2003? Some might argue yes. I would say they were more taking advantage of the situation and egging the US on. And I think the same thing is happening here with Venezuela. Either way, it's stupid. And this is happening at a time when the United States is already struggling with $38 trillion in debt? All of this costs money. And so while programs that help our fellow Americans are getting slashed left and right, we're spending more money on bombs, an additional, $8 billion for Israel's jets. I mean, it's just crazy. So it really shows what the priorities are for our government, Cenk. They don't care about us. They care about continuing the enrichment of the defense contractors and basically spurring new wars in areas that we really shouldn't be involved in. So that's what we're dealing with.
Yeah, my last point is, one, I'm gonna remind you about the poll. What's the dumbest country to bomb? Venezuela, Iran, Somalia, or Nigeria? That's on tyt.com. The reason I'm reminding you that is because the Venezuela bombing was done a little bit earlier this month. Nigeria and Somalia were bombed on Christmas Day. Somalia has been bombed 127 times. And after Netanyahu came, Trump talked about bombing Iran again on behalf of Israel. So Iran is winning there because this would be a bigger conflict, 92 million people, and potentially disastrous war in the Middle East. But guys, the biggest takeaway from all of that is no matter who you vote for, you always get a neocon. Trump ran on anti-war. This is the most pro-war administration I've seen since Dick Cheney, but I mean, he's putting Dick Cheney to shame. Dick Cheney had to work super hard to get us to invade Iraq, right? And Trump doesn't work hard at all. He's invading, I think he's bombed about 8 countries so far. Doesn't ask anybody for permission, doesn't declare war through Congress, doesn't make a case. We can't even figure out why he's bombing Venezuela. And so he just does it anyway. So the real problem isn't any of this. The real problem is corruption. Because as long as we have bribery legalized in this country, you're always going to get a deeply corrupt president. It doesn't matter which party they're from, and they're always going to start wars and make you pay for it. And it's always going to be on behalf of someone else and not us.
Riot police deploying tear gas on crowds, and thousands have come out onto the streets angry about inflation and corruption. Protesters can be heard chanting, "Don't be afraid, we are all together." But others chant death to the dictator. And the concern for the government will be that this anger at the economic situation morphs into a broader anti-regime movement. Iran's currency has collapsed to a record low, pushing an already heavily sanctioned economy deeper into turmoil.
Protests have broken out in Iran, and while the United States is basically treating the demonstrations as organically fueled by economic frustration, Israeli media seems to have a completely different take, right, Cenk?
Yeah, and I actually think that their reaction is a super interesting mystery, because it could either mean that they've got Mossad all over the streets in Iran, or they're pretending to. And why would they pretend to? That's also very interesting. So let's dive into it.
So if you look at the headlines in American media, you'll notice, well, something similar to what I'm about to read from the New York Times. Their headline read that surge of economic pain pushes Iranians to the streets. High inflation and a currency collapse have squeezed Iranians' budgets, challenging the country's leaders. Now, let me just say that it is true that Iran is really suffering economically. Part of the reason why is due to Trump increasing economic sanctions and making it more difficult for Iran to sell oil. So that certainly has something to do with it. But their currency seems to have collapsed. And so I don't deny for a second that Iranians are unhappy. I'm sure that some of these protesters decided to hit the streets organically. However, what's interesting is when you juxtapose that headline with what's being reported in Israeli media, well, you get a completely different story. So why don't we take a look at the Jerusalem Post, which noted that Mossad spurs Iran protests, says agents with demonstrators in Farsi message. As protests grow across Iran, the Mossad posted an unusual Farsi message urging demonstrators to act, saying it is with them in the streets amid rising economic pressure and public unrest. So it could be that people were frustrated with how the economy is going in Iran, started to take to the streets, and you might have Mossad agents involved, essentially egging them on or serving as provocateurs. And in fact, if you look at Mossad's Farsi X account, they have multiple accounts on X. One of them is in Farsi. They posted the following: "Let's come out to the streets together. The time has come. We are with you, not just from afar and verbally, we are with you in the field as well." And the Jerusalem Post reports in that same article that I read the headline from that the statement was a rare open acknowledgement from the Mossad regarding ongoing operations in Iran. Following the 12-day war, Mossad director David Barnea released a rare statement foreshadowing the spy agency's activities in Tehran, telling the general public that Israel will continue to be there like we have been there. And as we know, Israel has been pushing for regime change in Iran, so it wouldn't surprise me at all if they had operators within Iran, Mossad agents within the country, serving as provocateurs to egg on, civil unrest. But I'll give you a sense of how Iran is responding to the protesters in just a moment. But this is a little bit concerning, right? Because the United States, luckily, has not been dragged into a full-out war with Iran yet. We know that Benjamin Netanyahu has been pushing Trump to engage in a regime change war, as he's been doing, by the way, for many decades now. But Cenk, what do you think is really going on here? Because you did raise an interesting question. It could just be that Mossad is bluffing here, although I feel that Mossad has agents pretty much everywhere in every country. It would not surprise me if they had Mossad agents operating out of Iran right now.
No, the Mossad's all over Iran. That's no question at all. The question is, why are they publicly announcing it? So let me take it one step at a time. First, about American media. Look, their job is not to cover the news. Their job is to cover up the news. So when you're talking about unrest in Iran, is Israel or the CIA driving that unrest should be one of the very first questions you ask as a reporter. But it's religiously not covered by the American press, because God forbid they should challenge power. Right? So yes, inflation and the currency are giant issues and an actual part of the reason, huge part of the reason for for those protests, as far as we can tell from the outside, based on all of the reporting. But to leave out one of the biggest factors, as usual on behalf of Israel, is always super strange. So be wary of American media. They purposely don't tell you the whole picture, and that's the best case scenario for them. All right, now you go to Israeli press, where it's much more open. It's fascinating, maybe because it's harder to call the Israeli press anti-Semitic, but they have a much more open press, and we learned a lot from them. So in this case, why is Mossad announcing in the Israeli press and in Farsi so that the Iranians hear it, oh, we're right there in the streets with you? So there's a couple of possibilities. One is general psyops, just confuse your enemy, make them wonder if Mossad's in the crowd, making it more likely to fire into the crowd so that then the crowd gets angrier. Maybe, but that gets confusing. I'm not quite sure which way that breaks out, right? A second reason could be that they're just at the point, Israel's at the point where they're rubbing it in everyone's faces. We control the planet, there's nothing you could do. We're the ones creating this riot. We're gonna topple you. Sheldon Adelson's gonna fly Jonathan Pollard, the American trader, back on his private jet. Ha, America, we serve Israel, we don't serve you. They're just letting us all know Israel's in charge. Now, that doesn't have much of a purpose, but I don't know, their hubris is unmatched. I've never seen a country this arrogant before in my life, ordering everyone what to do, toppling regimes, attacking all of their neighbors, and getting anyone who objects across the world fired through their agents in all these different countries. So maybe they're just at the height of their power and overly arrogant. But again, that's so stupid that it's unlikely coming from Israel, who's usually pretty good about strategy. All right, now finally, the third possibility, Anna, is one I don't think a lot of people are thinking about. So look, what does Israel always demand? Regime change. They say, getting rid of your non-existent nukes is not enough, non-existent weapons of mass destruction, non-existent ties to Al Qaeda or ISIS, never enough. Now, any kind of missiles, not enough. And soon, slingshot, not enough. We invade, attack, until we get to regime change. Why? Because they want to permanently neuter that country. They want the leader of that country working for Israel instead of their own population. It's not like they're the first country to think of this. The CIA did this religiously throughout the world and probably still partakes in it, maybe along with the Israelis, etc. But you need a puppet to run that country. The worst case scenario is not the Ayatollah, is not a general or a dictator. The worst case scenario is democracy. Because if you had democracy in Iran or in the Arab countries, well, the leaders would be responsive to the local population and would despise Israel 20 times more, maybe 200 times more. So a democracy is super dangerous for Israel. They don't want it anywhere near the Middle East. So it might be that they're concerned that this is an organic uprising of the Iranian people, and if it succeeds, they might have an organic leader of the people of Iran, which would be more dangerous to them than the Ayatollah. Dictators are easier to control. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do. You actually bring up such an important point, because there's something that's true that the Israelis use to their advantage, but they twist it to their advantage. So the people of Iran are dissatisfied with the regime in Iran. They do want regime change, but they also do not want Israel and the United States to come in and install a puppet government, much as was the case many decades ago, right? The Ayatollah and the revolution that happened with the Ayatollah was a direct response to the US overthrowing a democratically elected leader in Iran and installing the Shah. So the idea that Iranians are like, oh yes, please, Israel, we are begging you to come in, destroy our country. Actually, I mean, Israel is pretty open about the fact that they want to balkanize Iran, which I'm pretty sure the residents of Iran would not want. But in terms of wanting a different regime, I don't deny that Iranians want that. And in fact, if you look at the reaction of the Iranian population after the 12-day war, it actually ended up rallying support for the regime in Iran, at least temporarily so, because they felt that they were under attack. And usually when a country is under attack, the population will rally behind their leaders. So we'll see how this plays out. one thing that I do know is that Israel just is not going to give up on this effort to essentially destroy every country they can and essentially make them pathetically subservient to them, much like the United States. And so since Iran is not subservient to Israel, I mean, they've been wanting regime change for a very long time. Yes, Israel has been funding proxy groups that have attacked Israel as Israel has engaged in their expansionist land theft policies. But nonetheless, we'll see how this plays out with Iran. I want the people of Iran to live in a country under the type of political leadership that makes them feel happy and represented. But that is very different from what Israel's agenda is here. So that's something to keep in mind.
My last two things are, look, the pro-Israel crowd does a lot of projections. So they're like, oh, so you like a pro-Islamist government. No, we're not ethnic radicals like the Israelis. No, we don't want an Islamic government at all, let alone a radical Islamic government, et cetera, in Iran. And yeah, the country's largely Shia Muslim, so they're gonna presumably have Muslim leadership, but we don't want it to be fundamentalist or radical in any way, shape, or form. We want the best representation for the Iranian people because we believe in peace and democracy and all those things we're supposed to believe in here in America, and we do actually believe them. So whereas the Israelis look at it as like we would favor our own ethnicity over everything else in the world, and we'd be super happy to impose our will upon. No, we're not thinking like that. I don't want to impose my will on the Iranian people. Look, I'd like to have a nice trading relationship and I'd like them to be free, but otherwise I don't really care. I want them to run their own country, right? So the second part here is attacking Iran would be deeply counterproductive because it would rally people to the flag, as Anna's talking about. The neocons have tried this before. Oh, if we attack Iraq, they want us to bomb them. And they'll be super happy and we'll be greeted as liberators. And I've debated people on this issue of Iran war, and the same neocons, the same Israel First crowd is still saying that maniacal thing of no, the Iranians want to be bombed. They love the idea of being bombed by America and Israel, and they hope it falls on their head and their families' heads. I mean, they're really lunatics, right? Like you'd have to be the dumbest person in America to believe that. But the only way that bombing Iran, like we just did with the nuclear sites, works is if you go all the way, for Israel's purposes. And you get regime change, you put the puppet in place, and that puppet stays for 20, 30 years, robbing the Iranians, making them subservient to Israel, et cetera. So that's why I think Netanyahu is getting a sense, and Israel's getting a sense, this is my best guess of the entire context. They're a little, they want to topple the regime, but they're a little worried about that movement in Iran being authentic. And they're like, we don't want that. No, they wouldn't put our puppet in place. No, okay, forget it, Trump, just go in all the way. Go in, pretend it's missiles, it's whatever, right? But we need a puppet, we need the regime change. And I'm not sure that these guys are gonna give us the regime change we want. The regime change we want is for Israel to be in charge. Every time you ring the bell below, an angel gets his wings. Totally not true, but it does keep you updated on our live shows.